20,000 Leagues Under the Seas, by Jules Verne. First Part. Chapter 21. Some Days Ashore. Stepping ashore had an exhilarating effect on me. Ned Land tested the soil with his foot as if he were laying claim to it. Yet it had been only 2 months since we had become, as Captain Nemo expressed it, passengers on the Nautilus. In other words, the literal prisoners of its commander. In a few minutes we were a gunshot away from the coast. The soil was almost entirely madreporic, but certain dry stream beds were strewn with granite rubble, proving that this island was of primordial origin. The entire horizon was hidden behind a curtain of wonderful forests. Enormous trees, sometimes as high as 200 feet, were linked to each other by garlands of tropical creepers, genuine natural hammocks that swayed in a mild breeze. There were mimosas, banyan trees, beefwood, teakwood, hibiscus, screw pines, palm trees, all mingling in wild profusion. And beneath the shade of their green canopies, at the feet of their gigantic trunks, there grew orchids, leguminous plants, and ferns. Meanwhile, ignoring all these fine specimens of Papuan flora, the Canadian passed up the decorative in favor of the functional. He spotted a coconut palm, beat down some of its fruit, broke them open, and we drank their milk and ate their meat with a pleasure that was a protest against our standard fare on the Nautilus. "Excellent," Ned Land said. "Exquisite," Conseil replied. "And I don't think," the Canadian said, "that your Nemo would object to us stashing a cargo of coconuts aboard his vessel?" "I imagine not," I replied, "but he won't want to sample them." "Too bad for him," Conseil said. "And plenty good for us," Ned Land shot back. "There will be more left over." "A word of caution, Mr. Land," I told the harpooner, who was about to ravage another coconut palm. "Coconuts are admirable things, but before we stuff the skiff with them, it would be wise to find out whether this island offers other substances just as useful. Some fresh vegetables would be well received in the Nautilus's pantry." "Master is right," Conseil replied, "and I propose that we set aside 3 places in our longboat, one for fruit, another for vegetables, and a third for venison, of which I still haven't glimpsed the tiniest specimen." "Don't give up so easily, Conseil," the Canadian replied. "So let's continue our excursion," I went on, "but keep a sharp lookout. This island seems uninhabited, but it still might harbor certain individuals who aren't so finicky about the sort of game they eat." "Hee hee!" Ned put in, with a meaningful movement of his jaws. "Ned! Oh, horrors!" Conseil exclaimed. "Ye gods!" the Canadian shot back. "I'm starting to appreciate the charms of cannibalism." "Ned, don't say that," Conseil answered. "You a cannibal? Why, I'll no longer be safe next to you, I who share your cabin. Does this mean I'll wake up half devoured one fine day?" "I'm awfully fond of you, Conseil, my friend, but not enough to eat you when there's better food around." "Then I daren't delay," Conseil replied. "The hunt is on. We absolutely must bag some game to placate this man-eater, or one of these mornings master won't find enough pieces of his manservant to serve him." While exchanging this chit-chat, we entered beneath the dark canopies of the forest, and for 2 hours we explored it in every direction. We couldn't have been luckier in our search for edible vegetation, and some of the most useful produce in the tropical zones supplied us with a valuable food-stuff missing on board. I mean the breadfruit tree, which is quite abundant on Gueboroa Island, and there I chiefly noted the seedless variety that in Malaysia is called rima. This tree is distinguished from other trees by a straight trunk 40 feet high. To the naturalist's eye, its gracefully rounded crown, formed of big multi-lobed leaves, was enough to denote the artocarpus that has been so successfully transplanted to the Mascarene Islands east of Madagascar. From its mass of greenery, huge globular fruit stood out, a decimeter wide, and furnished on the outside with creases that assumed a hexangular pattern. It's a handy plant that nature gives to regions lacking in wheat. Without needing to be cultivated, it bears fruit 8 months out of the year. Ned Land was on familiar terms with this fruit. He had already eaten it on his many voyages, and knew how to cook its edible substance. so the very sight of it aroused his appetite, and he couldn't control himself. "Sir," he told me, "I'll die if I don't sample a little breadfruit pasta." "Sample some, Ned, my friend, sample all you like. We're here to conduct experiments. Let's conduct them." "It won't take a minute," the Canadian replied. Equipped with a magnifying glass, he lit a fire of deadwood that was soon crackling merrily. Meanwhile, Conseil and I selected the finest artocarpus fruit. Some still weren't ripe enough, and their thick skins covered white, slightly fibrous pulps. But a great many others were yellowish and gelatinous, just begging to be picked. This fruit contained no pits. Conseil brought a dozen of them to Ned Land, who cut them into thick slices and placed them over a fire of live coals, all the while repeating, "You'll see, sir, how tasty this bread is." "Especially since we've gone without baked goods for so long," Conseil said. "It's more than just bread," the Canadian added. "It's a dainty pastry. You've never eaten any, sir?" "No, Ned." "All right. Get ready for something downright delectable. If you don't come back for seconds, I'm no longer the king of harpooners." After a few minutes, the parts of the fruit exposed to the fire were completely toasted. On the inside there appeared some white pasta, a sort of soft bread centre whose flavour reminded me of artichoke. This bread was excellent, I must admit, and I ate it with great pleasure. "Unfortunately," I said, "this pasta won't stay fresh, so it seems pointless to make a supply for on board." "By thunder, sir!" Ned Land exclaimed. "There you go, talking like a naturalist. But meantime I'll be acting like a baker. Conseil, harvest some of this fruit to take with us when we go back." "And how will you prepare it?" I asked the Canadian. "I'll make a fermented batter from its pulp that'll keep indefinitely without spoiling. When I want some, I'll just cook it in the galley on board. It'll have a slightly tart flavour, but you'll find it excellent." "So, Mr. Ned, I see that this bread is all we need." "Not quite, Professor," the Canadian replied. "We need some fruit to go with it, or at least some vegetables." "Then let's look for fruit and vegetables." When our breadfruit harvesting was done, we took to the trail to complete this dry land dinner. We didn't search in vain, and near noontime we had an ample supply of bananas. This delicious produce from the torrid zones ripens all year round, and Malaysians, who give them the name pisang, eat them without bothering to cook them. In addition to bananas, we gathered some enormous jackfruit with a very tangy flavour, some tasty mangoes, and some pineapples of unbelievable size. But this foraging took up a good deal of our time, which even so we had no cause to regret. Conseil kept Ned under observation. The harpooner walked in the lead, and during his stroll through the forest he gathered with sure hands some excellent fruit that should have completed his provisions. "So," Conseil asked, "you have everything you need, Ned, my friend?" "Humph," the Canadian put in. "What? You're complaining?" "All this vegetation doesn't make a meal," Ned replied. "Just side dishes, dessert. But where's the soup course? Where's the roast?" "Right," I said. "Ned promised us cutlets, which seems highly questionable to me." "Sir," the Canadian replied, "our hunting not only isn't over, it hasn't even started. Patience! We're sure to end up bumping into some animal with either feathers or fur, if not in this locality, then in another. And if not today, then tomorrow, because we mustn't wander too far off," Conseil added. "That's why I propose that we return to the skiff." "What? Already?" Ned exclaimed. "We ought to be back before nightfall," I said. "But what hour is it then?" the Canadian asked. 2 o'clock at least," Conseil replied. "How time flies on solid ground!" exclaimed Mr. Ned Land with a sigh of regret. "Off we go," Conseil replied. So we returned through the forest, and we completed our harvest by making a clean sweep of some palm cabbages that had to be picked from the crowns of their trees, some small beans that I recognized as the abrou of the Malaysians, and some high-quality yams. We were overloaded when we arrived at the skiff. However, Ned Land still found these provisions inadequate. But fortune smiled on him. Just as we were boarding, he spotted several trees, 25 to 30 feet high, belonging to the palm species. As valuable as the artocarpus, these trees are justly ranked among the most useful produce in Malaysia. They were sago palms, vegetation that grows without being cultivated. Like mulberry trees, they reproduce by means of shoots and seeds. Ned Land knew how to handle these trees. Taking his axe and wielding it with great vigour, he soon stretched out on the ground 2 or 3 sago palms whose maturity was revealed by the white dust sprinkled over their palm fronds. I watched him more as a naturalist than as a man in hunger. He began by removing from each trunk an inch-thick strip of bark that covered a network of long, hopelessly tangled fibres that were puttied with a sort of gummy flour. This flour was the starch-like sago, an edible substance chiefly consumed by the Melanesian peoples. For the time being, Ned Land was content to chop these trunks into pieces, as if he were making firewood. Later he would extract the flour by sifting it through cloth to separate it from its fibrous ligaments, let it dry out in the sun, and leave it to harden inside moulds. Finally, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, laden with all our treasures, we left the island beach, and half an hour later pulled alongside the Nautilus. Nobody appeared on our arrival. The enormous sheet-iron cylinder seemed deserted. Our provisions loaded on board, I went below to my stateroom. There I found my supper ready. I ate, and then fell asleep. The next day, January 6th, nothing new on board. Not a sound inside, not a sign of life. The skiff stayed alongside in the same place we had left it. We decided to return to Gueboroa Island. Ned Land hoped for better luck in his hunting than on the day before, and he wanted to visit a different part of the forest. By sunrise we were off. Carried by an inbound current, the longboat reached the island in a matter of moments. We disembarked, and thinking it best to abide by the Canadian's instincts, we followed Ned Land, whose long legs threatened to outpace us. Ned Land went westward up the coast, then, fording some stream beds, he reached open plains that were bordered by wonderful forests. Some kingfishers lurked along the watercourses, but they didn't let us approach. Their cautious behaviour proved to me that these winged creatures knew where they stood on bipeds of our species, and I concluded that if this island wasn't inhabited, at least human beings paid it frequent visits. After crossing a pretty lush prairie, we arrived on the outskirts of a small wood, enlivened by the singing and soaring of a large number of birds. "Still, they're merely birds," Conseil said. "But some are edible," the harpooner replied. "Wrong, Ned, my friend," Conseil answered, "because I see only ordinary parrots here." "Conseil, my friend," Ned replied in all seriousness, "parrots are like pheasant to people with nothing else on their plates." "And I might add," I said, "that when these birds are properly cooked, they're at least worth a stab of the fork." Indeed, under the dense foliage of this wood, a whole host of parrots fluttered from branch to branch, needing only the proper upbringing to speak human dialects. At present they were cackling in chorus with parakeets of every colour, with solemn cockatoos that seemed to be pondering some philosophical problem, while bright red lories passed by like pieces of bunting borne on the breeze. In the midst of Kaloa parrots raucously on the wing, Papuan lories painted the subtlest shades of azure, and a whole variety of delightful winged creatures, none terribly edible. However, one bird unique to these shores, which never passes beyond the boundaries of the Aru and Papuan Islands, was missing from this collection, but I was given a chance to marvel at it soon enough. After crossing through a moderately dense thicket, we again found some plains obstructed by bushes. There I saw some magnificent birds soaring aloft, the arrangement of their long feathers causing them to head into the wind. Their undulating flight, the grace of their aerial curves, and the play of their colours allured and delighted the eye. I had no trouble identifying them. "Birds of paradise!" I exclaimed. "Order Passeriforma, division Clystomora," Conseil replied. "Partridge family?" Ned Land asked. "I doubt it, Mr. Land. Nevertheless, I'm counting on your dexterity to catch me one of those delightful representatives of tropical nature." "I'll give it a try, Professor, though I'm handier with a harpoon than a rifle." Malaysians, who do a booming business in these birds with the Chinese, have various methods for catching them that we couldn't use. Sometimes they set snares on the tops of the tall trees that the bird of paradise prefers to inhabit. At other times they capture it with a tenacious glue that paralyzes its movements. They will even go so far as to poison the springs where these fowl habitually drink. But in our case, All we could do was fire at them on the wing, which left us little chance of getting one, and in truth we used up a good part of our ammunition in vain. Near 11 o'clock in the morning we cleared the lower slopes of the mountains that form the island's centre, and we still hadn't bagged a thing. Hunger spurred us on. The hunters had counted on consuming the proceeds of their hunting, but they had miscalculated. Luckily, and much to his surprise, Conseil pulled off a right and left shot and ensured our breakfast. He brought down a white pigeon and a ring-dove, which were briskly plucked, hung from a spit, and roasted over a blazing fire of deadwood. While these fascinating animals were cooking, Ned prepared some bread from the artocarpus. Then the pigeon and ring-dove were devoured to the bones and declared excellent. Nutmeg, on which these birds habitually gorge themselves, sweetens their flesh and makes it delicious eating. "They taste like chicken stuffed with truffles," Conseil said. "All right, Ned," I asked the Canadian. "Now what do you need?" "Game with 4 paws, Professor Aronnax," Ned Land replied. "All these pigeons are only appetizers, snacks, so till I've bagged an animal with cutlets, I won't be happy." "Nor I, Ned, until I've caught a bird of paradise." "Then let's keep hunting," Conseil replied. "But while heading back to the sea, we've arrived at the foothills of these mountains, and I think we'll do better if we return to the forest regions." It was good advice, and we took it. After an hour's walk, we reached a genuine sago palm forest. A few harmless snakes fled underfoot. Birds of paradise stole off at our approach, and I was in real despair of catching one, when Conseil, walking in the lead, stooped suddenly, gave a triumphant shout, and came back to me, carrying a magnificent bird of paradise. "Oh, bravo, Conseil!" I exclaimed. "Master is too kind," Conseil replied. "Not at all, my boy. That was a stroke of genius, catching one of these live birds with your bare hands. If master will examine it closely, he'll see I deserve no great praise." "And why not, Conseil?" "Because this bird is as drunk as a lord." "Drunk?" "Yes, master, drunk from the nutmegs it was devouring under the nutmeg tree where I caught it. See, Ned, my friend, see the monstrous results of intemperance." "Damnation!" the Canadian shot back. "Considering the amount of gin I've had these past 2 months, you've got nothing to complain about." Meanwhile, I was examining this unusual bird. Conseil was not mistaken. Tipsy from that potent juice, our bird of paradise had been reduced to helplessness. It was unable to fly, it was barely able to walk. But this didn't alarm me, and I just let it sleep off its nutmeg. The bird belonged to the finest of the 8 species credited to Papua and its neighboring islands. It was a great emerald, one of the rarest birds of paradise. It measured 3 decimeters long. Its head was comparatively small, and its eyes, placed near the opening of its beak, were also small. But it offered a wonderful mixture of hues: a yellow beak, brown feet and claws, hazel wings with purple tips, pale yellow head and scruff of the neck, emerald throat, the belly and chest maroon to brown. 2 strands, made of a horn substance covered with down, rose over its tail, which was lengthened by long, very light feathers of wonderful fineness, and they completed the costume of this marvelous bird that the islanders have poetically named the sunbird. How I wished I could take this superb bird of paradise back to Paris, to make a gift of it to the zoo at the Botanical Gardens, which doesn't own a single live specimen. "So it must be a rarity or something?" the Canadian asked, in the tone of a hunter who, from the viewpoint of his art, gives the game a pretty low rating. "A great rarity, my gallant comrade, and above all very hard to capture alive. And even after they're dead, there's still a major market for these birds, so the natives have figured out how to create fake ones, like people create fake pearls or diamonds." "What?" Conseil exclaimed. "They make counterfeit birds of paradise?" "Yes, Conseil. And is master familiar with how the islanders go about?" "Perfectly familiar. During the easterly monsoon season, birds of paradise lose the magnificent feathers around their tails that naturalists call below-the-wing feathers. These feathers are gathered by the fowl forgers and skilfully fitted onto some poor, previously mutilated parakeet. Then they paint over the suture, varnish the bird, and ship the fruits of their unique labours to museums and collectors in Europe." "Good enough," Ned Land put in. "If it isn't the right bird, it's still the right feathers, and so long as the merchandise isn't meant to be eaten, I see no great harm." But if my desires were fulfilled by the capture of this bird of paradise, those of our Canadian huntsmen remained unsatisfied. Luckily, near 2 o'clock, Ned Land brought down a magnificent wild pig of the type the natives call bari-outang. This animal came in the nick of time for us to bag some real quadruped meat, and it was warmly welcomed. Ned Land proved himself quite gloriously with his gunshot. Hit by an electric bullet, the pig dropped dead on the spot. The Canadian properly skinned and cleaned it, after removing half a dozen cutlets, destined to serve as the grilled meat course of our evening meal. Then the hunt was on again, and once more would be marked by the exploits of Ned and Conseil. In essence, beating the bushes, the two friends flushed a herd of kangaroos that fled by, bounding away on their elastic paws. But these animals didn't flee so swiftly that our electric capsules couldn't catch up with them. "Oh, Professor!" shouted Ned Land, whose hunting fever had gone to his brain. "What excellent game, especially in a stew! What a supply for the Nautilus! 2, 3, 5 down! And just think how we'll devour all this meat ourselves, while those numbskulls on board won't get a shred." In his uncontrollable glee, I think the Canadian might have slaughtered the whole horde, if he hadn't been so busy talking. But he was content with a dozen of these fascinating marsupials, which make up the first order of aplacental mammals, as Conseil just had to tell us. These animals were small in stature. They were a species of those rabbit kangaroos that usually dwell in the hollows of trees and are tremendously fast, but although of moderate dimensions, they at least furnish a meat that's highly prized. We were thoroughly satisfied with the results of our hunting. A gleeful Ned proposed that we return the next day to this magic island, which he planned to depopulate of its every edible quadruped, but he was reckoning without events. By 6 o'clock in the evening we were back on the beach. The skiff was aground in its usual place. The Nautilus, looking like a long reef, emerged from the waves 2 miles offshore. Without further ado, Ned Land got down to the important business of dinner. He came wonderfully to terms with its entire cooking. Grilling over the coals, those cutlets from the bari-outang soon gave off a succulent aroma that perfumed the air. But I catch myself following in the Canadian's footsteps. Look at me, in ecstasy over freshly grilled pork. Please grant me a pardon, as I've already granted one to Mr. Land, and on the same grounds. In short, dinner was excellent. 2 ring-doves rounded out this extraordinary menu. Sago pasta, bread from the artocarpus, mangoes, half a dozen pineapples, and the fermented liquor from certain coconuts heightened our glee. I suspect that my 2 fine companions weren't quite as clear-headed as one could wish. "What if we don't return to the Nautilus this evening?" Conseil said. "What if we never return to it?" Ned Land added. Just then a stone whizzed toward us, landed at our feet, and cut short the harpooner's proposition. End of chapter 21.
"20,000 Leagues Under the Sea" by Jules Verne. First part, Chapter 22, The Lightning Bolts of Captain Nemo. Without standing up, we stared in the direction of the forest, my hand stopping halfway to my mouth, Ned Land's completing its assignment. "Stones don't fall from the sky," Conseil said, "or else they deserve to be called meteorites." A second well-polished stone removed a tasty ring-dove leg from Conseil's hand, giving still greater relevance to his observation. We all 3 stood up, rifles to our shoulders, ready to answer any attack. "Apes, maybe?" Ned Land exclaimed. "Nearly," Conseil replied. "Savages." "Head for the skiff," I said, moving toward the sea. Indeed, it was essential to beat a retreat, because some 20 natives, armed with bows and slings, appeared barely 100 paces off, on the outskirts of a thicket that masked the horizon to our right. The skiff was aground 10 fathoms away from us. The savages approached without running, but they favored us with a show of the greatest hostility. It was raining stones and arrows. Ned Land was unwilling to leave his provisions behind, and despite the impending danger, he clutched his pig on one side, his kangaroos on the other, and scampered off with respectable speed. In 2 minutes we were on the strand, loading provisions and weapons into the skiff, pushing it to the sea, and positioning its 2 oars were the work of an instant. We hadn't gone 2 cable lengths when 100 savages, howling and gesticulating, entered the water up to their waists. I looked to see if their appearance might draw some of the Nautilus's men onto the platform. But no, lying well out, that enormous machine still seemed completely deserted. 20 minutes later we boarded the ship. The hatches were open. After mooring the skiff, we re-entered the Nautilus's interior. I went below to the lounge, from which some chords were wafting. Captain Nemo was there, leaning over the organ, deep in a musical trance. "Captain," I said to him. He didn't hear me. "Captain," I went on, touching him with my hand. He trembled, and turning around, "Ah, it's you, Professor," he said to me. "Well, did you have a happy hunt? Was your herb gathering a success?" "Yes, Captain," I replied, "but unfortunately we brought back a horde of bipeds whose proximity worries me." "What sort of bipeds?" "Savages." "Savages?" Captain Nemo replied in an ironic tone. "You set foot on one of the shores of this globe, Professor, and you're surprised to find savages there? Where aren't there savages? And besides, are they any worse than men elsewhere, these people you call savages?" "But Captain—" "Speaking for myself, sir, I've encountered them everywhere." "Well then," I replied, "if you don't want to welcome them aboard the Nautilus, you'd better take some precautions." "Easy, Professor. No cause for alarm." "But there are a large number of these natives." "What's your count?" "At least 100." "Professor Aronnax," replied Captain Nemo, whose fingers took their place on the organ keys, "if every islander in the Papua were to gather on that beach, the Nautilus would still have nothing to fear from their attacks." The captain's fingers then ran over the instrument's keyboards, and I noticed that he touched only its black keys, which gave his melodies a basically Scottish color. Soon he had forgotten my presence and was lost in a reverie that I no longer tried to dispel. I climbed onto the platform. Night had already fallen, because in this low latitude the sun sets quickly without any twilight. I could see Gueboroa Island only dimly, but numerous fires had been kindled on the beach, attesting that the natives had no thoughts of leaving it. For several hours I was left to myself, sometimes musing on the islanders, but no longer fearing them because the captain's unflappable confidence had won me over, and sometimes forgetting them to marvel at the splendors of this tropical night. My memories took wing toward France, in the wake of those zodiacal stars due to twinkle over it in a few hours. The moon shone in the midst of the constellations at their zenith. I then remembered that this loyal, good-natured satellite would return to this same place the day after tomorrow, to raise the tide and tear the Nautilus from its coral bed. Near midnight, seeing that all was quiet over the darkened waves as well as under the waterside trees, I repaired to my cabin and fell into a peaceful sleep. The night passed without mishap. No doubt the Papuans had been frightened off by the mere sight of this monster aground in the bay, because our hatches stayed open, offering easy access to the Nautilus's interior. At 6 o'clock in the morning, January 8th, I climbed onto the platform. The morning shadows were lifting. The island was soon on view through the dissolving mists. First its beaches, then its summits. The islanders were still there, in greater numbers than on the day before, perhaps 500 or 600 of them. Taking advantage of the low tide, some of them had moved forward over the heads of the coral to within 2 cable lengths of the Nautilus. I could easily distinguish them. They were obviously true Papuans, men of fine stock, athletic in build, forehead high and broad, nose large but not flat, teeth white. Their woolly, red-tinted hair was in sharp contrast to their bodies, which were black and glistening, like those of Nubians. Beneath their pierced, distended earlobes there dangled strings of beads made from bone. Generally these savages were naked. I noted some women among them, dressed from hip to knee in grass skirts held up by belts made of vegetation. Some of the chieftains adorned their necks with crescents and necklaces made from beads of red and white glass. Armed with bows, arrows, and shields, nearly all of them carried from their shoulders a sort of net, which held those polished stones their slings hurl with such dexterity. One of these chieftains came fairly close to the Nautilus, examining it with care. He must have been a Madu of high rank, because he paraded in a mat of banana leaves that had ragged edges and was accented with bright colors. I could easily have picked off this islander, he stood at such close range, but I thought it best to wait for an actual show of hostility. Between Europeans and savages, it's acceptable for Europeans to shoot back, but not to attack first. During this whole time of low tide, the islanders lurked near the Nautilus, but they weren't boisterous. I often heard them repeat the word "asai," and from their gestures I understood they were inviting me to go ashore, an invitation I felt obliged to decline. So the skiff didn't leave shipside that day, much to the displeasure of Mr. Land, who couldn't complete his provisions. The adroit Canadian spent his time preparing the meat and flour products he had brought from Gueboroa Island. As for the savages, they went back to shore near 11 o'clock in the morning, when the heads of the coral began to disappear under the waves of the rising tide. But I saw their numbers swell considerably on the beach. It was likely that they had come from neighboring islands, or from the mainland of Papua proper. However, I didn't see one local dugout canoe. Having nothing better to do, I decided to dredge these beautiful clear waters, which exhibited a profusion of shells, zoophytes, and open-sea plants. Besides, it was the last day the Nautilus would spend in these waterways. If tomorrow it still floated off to the open sea as Captain Nemo had promised. So I summoned Conseil, who brought me a small, light dragnet similar to those used in oyster fishing. "What about these savages?" Conseil asked me. "With all due respect, master, they don't strike me as very wicked." "They're cannibals, even so, my boy." "A person can be both a cannibal and a decent man," Conseil replied, "just as a person can be both gluttonous and honorable. The one doesn't exclude the other." "Fine, Conseil. And I agree that there are honorable cannibals who decently devour their prisoners. However, I'm opposed to being devoured, even in all decency, so I'll keep on my guard, especially since the Nautilus's commander seems to be taking no precautions. And now let's get to work." For 2 hours our fishing proceeded energetically, but without bringing up any rarities. Our dragnet was filled with Midas, abalone, harp shells, obelisk snails, and especially the finest hammer shells I had seen to that day. We also gathered in a few sea cucumbers, some pearl oysters, and a dozen small turtles that we saved for the ship's pantry. But just when I least expected it, I laid my hands on a wonder, a natural deformity I'd have to call it, something very seldom encountered. Conseil had just made a cast of the dragnet, and his gear had come back up loaded with a variety of fairly ordinary seashells, when suddenly he saw me plunge my arms swiftly into the net, pull out a shelled animal, and give a conchological yell, in other words, the most piercing yell a human throat can produce. "Eh? What happened to master?" Conseil asked, very startled. "Did master get bitten?" "No, my boy, but I'd gladly have sacrificed a finger for such a find." "What find?" "This shell," I said, displaying the subject of my triumph. "But that's simply an olive shell of the tent olive species. Genus Olivia, order Pectembranchia, class Gastropoda, branch Mollusca." "Yes, yes, Conseil, but instead of coiling from right to left, this olive shell rolls from left to right." "It can't be," Conseil exclaimed. "Yes, my boy, it's a left-handed shell." "A left-handed shell?" Conseil repeated, his heart pounding. "Look at its spiral." "Oh, master can trust me on this," Conseil said, taking the valuable shell in his trembling hands. "But never have I felt such excitement." And there was good reason to be excited. In fact, as naturalists have ventured to observe, dextrality is a well-known law of nature. In their rotational and orbital movements, stars and their satellites go from right to left. Man uses his right hand more often than his left, and consequently his various instruments and equipment, staircases, locks, watch springs, etc., are designed to be used in a right-to-left manner. Now then, nature has generally obeyed this law in coiling her shells. They are right-handed with only rare exceptions, and when by chance a shell spiral is left-handed, collectors will pay its weight in gold for it. So Conseil and I were deep in contemplation of our treasure, and I was solemnly promising myself to enrich the Paris Museum with it, when an ill-timed stone hurled by one of the islanders whizzed over and shattered the valuable object in Conseil's hand. I gave a yell of despair. Conseil pounced on his rifle, and aimed at a savage swinging a sling just 10 meters away from him. I tried to stop him, but his shot went off and shattered a bracelet of amulets dangling from the islander's arm. "Conseil!" I shouted. "Conseil! Eh? What? Didn't Master see that this man-eater initiated the attack?" "A shell isn't worth a human life," I told him. "Oh, the rascal!" Conseil exclaimed. "I'd rather he cracked my shoulder." Conseil was in dead earnest, but I didn't subscribe to his views. However, the situation had changed in only a short time, and we hadn't noticed. Now some 20 dugout canoes were surrounding the Nautilus. Hollowed from tree trunks, these dugouts were long, narrow, and well designed for speed, keeping their balance by means of 2 bamboo poles that floated on the surface of the water. They were maneuvered by skillful, half-naked paddlers, and I viewed their advance with definite alarm. It was obvious these Papuans had already entered into relations with Europeans, and knew their ships. But this long iron cylinder lying in the bay, with no masts or funnels, what were they to make of it? Nothing good, because at first they kept it at a respectful distance. However, seeing that it stayed motionless, they regained their confidence little by little and tried to become more familiar with it. Now then, it was precisely this familiarity that we needed to prevent. Since our weapons made no sound when they went off, they would have only a moderate effect on these islanders, who reputedly respect nothing but noisy mechanisms. Without thunderclaps, lightning bolts would be much less frightening, although the danger lies in the flash, not the noise. Just then the dugout canoes drew nearer to the Nautilus, and a cloud of arrows burst over us. "Fire and brimstone it's hailing," Conseil said, "and poisoned hail, perhaps." "We've got to alert Captain Nemo," I said, re-entering the hatch. I went below to the lounge. I found no one there. I ventured a knock at the door opening into the captain's stateroom. The word "Enter" answered me. I did so, and found Captain Nemo busy with calculations in which there was no shortage of x and other algebraic signs. "Am I disturbing you?" I said, out of politeness. "Correct, Professor Aronnax," the captain answered me. "But I imagine you have pressing reasons for looking me up?" "Very pressing. Native dugout canoes are surrounding us, and in a few minutes we are sure to be assaulted by several hundred savages." "Ah," Captain Nemo put in serenely, "they have come in their dugouts?" "Yes, sir." "Well, sir, closing the hatches should do the trick." "Precisely, and that's what I came to tell you." "Nothing easier," Captain Nemo said. And he pressed an electric button, transmitting an order to the crew's quarters. "There, sir, all under control," he told me after a few moments. "The skiff is in place and the hatches are closed. I don't imagine you're worried that these gentlemen will stave in the walls that shells from your frigate couldn't breach?" "No, Captain, but one danger still remains." "What's that, sir?" "Tomorrow at about this time we'll need to reopen the hatches to renew the Nautilus's air." "No argument, sir, since our craft breathes in the manner favored by cetaceans." "But if these Papuans are occupying the platform at that moment, I don't see how you can prevent them from entering." "Then, sir, you assume they'll board the ship?" "I'm certain of it." "Well, sir, let them come aboard. I see no reason to prevent them. Deep down they're just poor devils, these Papuans. And I don't want my visit to Gueboroa Island to cost the life of a single one of these unfortunate people." On this note I was about to withdraw, but Captain Nemo detained me and invited me to take a seat next to him. He questioned me with interest on our excursions ashore and on our hunting, but seemed not to understand the Canadian's passionate craving for red meat. Then our conversation skimmed various subjects, and without being more forthcoming, Captain Nemo proved more affable. Among other things, we came to talk of the Nautilus's circumstances aground in the same strait where Captain Dumont d'Urville had nearly miscarried. Then, pertinent to this, "He was one of your great seamen," the captain told me, "one of your shrewdest navigators, that d'Urville. He was the Frenchman's Captain Cook, a man wise but unlucky, braving the ice banks of the South Pole, the coral of Oceania, the cannibals of the Pacific, only to perish wretchedly in a train wreck. If that energetic man was able to think about his life in its last seconds, imagine what his final thoughts must have been. As he spoke, Captain Nemo seemed deeply moved, and emotion I felt was to his credit. Then, chart in hand, we returned to the deeds of the French navigator, his voyages to circumnavigate the globe, his double attempt at the South Pole, which led to his discovery of the Adelie coast and the Louis Philippe Peninsula, finally his hydrographic surveys of the chief islands in Oceania. "What your d'Urville did on the surface of the sea," Captain Nemo told me, "I've done in the ocean's interior, but more easily, more completely than he." Constantly tossed by the hurricanes, the Zealous and the new Astrolabe couldn't compare with the Nautilus, a quiet work room truly at rest in the midst of the waters. "Even so, Captain," I said, "there is one major similarity between Dumont d'Urville's sloops of war and the Nautilus." "What's that, sir?" "Like them, the Nautilus has run aground." "The Nautilus is not aground, sir," Captain Nemo replied icily. "The Nautilus was built to rest on the ocean floor, and I don't need to undertake the arduous labors, the maneuvers d'Urville had to attempt in order to float off his sloops of war. The Zealous and the new Astrolabe well nigh perished, but my Nautilus is in no danger. Tomorrow, on the day stated, and at the hour stated, the tide will peacefully lift it off, and it will resume its navigating through the seas." "Captain," I said, "I don't doubt—" "Tomorrow," Captain Nemo added, standing up, "tomorrow at 2:40 in the afternoon, the Nautilus will float off and exit the Torres Strait undamaged." Pronouncing these words in an extremely sharp tone, Captain Nemo gave me a curt bow. This was my dismissal, and I re-entered my stateroom. There I found Conseil, who wanted to know the upshot of my interview with the captain. "My boy," I replied, "when I expressed the belief that these Papuan natives were a threat to his Nautilus, the captain answered me with great irony. 'So I've just one thing to say to you. Have faith in him and sleep in peace.' Master has no need for my services?" "No, my friend. What's Ned Land up to?" "Begging master's indulgence," Conseil replied, "but our friend Ned is concocting a kangaroo pie that will be the eighth wonder." I was left to myself. I went to bed, but slept pretty poorly. I kept hearing noises from the savages who were stamping on the platform and letting out deafening yells. The night passed in this way without the crew ever emerging from their usual inertia. They were no more disturbed by the presence of these man-eaters than soldiers in an armored fortress are troubled by ants running over the armor plate. I got up at 6 o'clock in the morning. The hatches weren't open, so the air inside hadn't been renewed. But the air tanks were kept full for any eventuality, and would function appropriately to shoot a few cubic meters of oxygen into the Nautilus's thin atmosphere. I worked in my stateroom until noon, without seeing Captain Nemo even for an instant. Nobody on board seemed to be making any preparations for departure. I still waited for a while. Then I made my way to the main lounge. Its timepiece marked 2:30. In 10 minutes the tide would reach its maximum elevation, and if Captain Nemo hadn't made a rash promise, the Nautilus would immediately break free. If not, many months might pass before it could leave its coral bed. But some preliminary vibrations could soon be felt over the boat's hull. I heard its plating grind against the limestone roughness of that coral base. At 2:35 Captain Nemo appeared in the lounge. "We are about to depart," he said. "Ah," I put in, "I've given orders to open the hatches." "What about the Papuans?" "What about them?" Captain Nemo replied with a slight shrug of his shoulders. "Won't they come inside the Nautilus?" "How will they manage that?" "By jumping down the hatches you're about to open." "Professor Aronnax," Captain Nemo replied serenely, "the Nautilus's hatches aren't to be entered in that fashion, even when they're open." I gaped at the captain. "You don't understand?" he said to me. "Not in the least." "Well, come along and you'll see." I headed to the central companionway. There, very puzzled, Ned Land and Conseil watched the crewmen opening the hatches, while a frightful clamor and furious shouts resounded outside. The hatch lids fell back onto the outer plating. 20 horrible faces appeared. But when the first islander laid hands on the companionway railing, he was flung backwards by some invisible power, Lord knows what. He ran off, howling in terror and wildly prancing around. 10 of his companions followed him. All 10 met the same fate. Conseil was in ecstasy. Carried away by his violent instincts, Ned Land leaped up the companionway, but as soon as his hand seized the railing he was thrown backward in his turn. "Damnation!" he exclaimed. "I've been struck by a lightning bolt!" These words explained everything to me. It wasn't just a railing that led to the ship's platform. It was a metal cable fully charged with the ship's electricity. Anyone who touched it got a fearsome shock, and such a shock would have been fatal if Captain Nemo had thrown the full current from his equipment into this conducting cable. It could honestly be said that he had stretched between himself and his assailants a network of electricity no one could clear with impunity. Meanwhile, crazed with terror, the unhinged Papuans beat a retreat. As for us, half laughing, we massaged and comforted poor Ned Land, who was swearing like one possessed. But just then, lifted off by the tide's final undulations, the Nautilus left its coral bed at exactly the 40th minute pinpointed by the captain. Its propeller churned the waves with lazy majesty. Gathering speed little by little, the ship navigated on the surface of the ocean, and safe and sound it left behind the dangerous narrows of the Torres Strait. End of chapter 22. Recorded by Michael John Geddes. September 30th, 2006. Indianapolis, Indiana, USA.
"20,000 Leagues Under the Seas" by Jules Verne. First part, Chapter 23. Aigri Somnia. The following day, January 10, the Nautilus resumed its travels in mid-water, but at a remarkable speed that I estimated to be at least 35 miles per hour. The propeller was going so fast I could neither follow nor count its revolutions. I thought about how this marvelous electric force not only gave motion, heat, and light to the Nautilus, but even protected it against outside attack, transforming it into a sacred ark no profane hand could touch without being blasted. My wonderment was boundless, and it went from the submersible itself to the engineer who had created it. We were travelling due west, and on January 11 we doubled Cape Wessel, located in longitude 135 degrees and latitude 10 degrees north, the western tip of the Gulf of Carpentaria. Reefs were still numerous, but more widely scattered, and were fixed on the chart with the greatest accuracy. The Nautilus easily avoided the money breakers to port and the Victoria Reefs to starboard, positioned at longitude 130 degrees on the 10th parallel, which we went along rigorously. On January 13, arriving in the Timor Sea, Captain Nemo raised the island of that name at longitude 122 degrees. This island, whose surface area measures 1,625 square leagues, is governed by rajahs. These aristocrats deem themselves the sons of crocodiles, in other words, descendants with the most exalted origins to which a human being can lay claim. Accordingly, their scaly ancestors infest the island's rivers and are the subjects of special veneration. They are sheltered, nurtured, flattered, pampered, and offered a ritual diet of nubile maidens, and woe to the foreigner who lifts a finger against these sacred saurians. But the Nautilus wanted nothing to do with these nasty animals. Timor Island was visible for barely an instant at noon while the chief officer determined his position. I also caught only a glimpse of Little Roti Island, part of this same group, whose women have a well-established reputation for beauty in the Malaysian marketplace. After our position fix, the Nautilus's latitude bearings were modulated to the southwest. Our prow pointed to the Indian Ocean. Where would Captain Nemo's fancies take us? Would he head up to the shores of Asia? Would he pull nearer to the beaches of Europe? Unlikely choices for a man who avoided populated areas. So would he go down south? Would he double the Cape of Good Hope, then Cape Horn, and push on to the Antarctic Pole? Finally, would he return to the seas of the Pacific, where his Nautilus could navigate freely and easily? Time would tell. After cruising along the Cartier, Hibernia, Seringapatam, and Scott Reefs, the solid element's last exertions against the liquid element, we were beyond all sight of shore by January 14. The Nautilus slowed down in an odd manner, and very unpredictable in its ways, it sometimes swam in the midst of the waters, sometimes drifted on their surface. During this phase of our voyage Captain Nemo conducted interesting experiments on the different temperatures in various strata of the sea. Under ordinary conditions, such readings are obtained using some pretty complicated instruments, whose findings are dubious to say the least, whether they're thermometric sounding lines, whose glass often shatters under the water's pressure, or those devices based on the varying resistance of metals to electric currents. The results so obtained can't be adequately double-checked. By contrast, Captain Nemo would seek the sea's temperatures by going himself into its depths, and when he placed his thermometer in contact with the various layers of liquid, he found the sought-for degree immediately and with certainty. And so, by loading up its ballast tanks, or by sinking obliquely with its slanting fins, the Nautilus successfully reached depths of 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, 7,000, 9,000, and 10,000 meters, and the ultimate conclusion from these experiments was that, in all latitudes, the sea had a permanent temperature of 4.5 degrees centigrade at a depth of 1,000 meters. I watched these experiments with the most intense fascination. Captain Nemo brought a real passion to them. I often wondered why he took these observations. Were they for the benefit of his fellow man? It was unlikely, because sooner or later his work would perish with him in some unknown sea. Unless he intended the results of experiments for me. But that meant this strange voyage of mine would come to an end, and no such end was in sight. Be that as it may, Captain Nemo also introduced me to the different data he had obtained on the relative densities of the water in our globe's chief seas. From this news I derived some personal enlightenment having nothing to do with science. It happened the morning of January 15. The captain, with whom I was strolling on the platform, asked me if I knew how salt water differs in density from sea to sea. I said no, adding that there was a lack of rigorous scientific observations on this subject. I have taken such observations, he told me, and I can vouch for their reliability. Fine, I replied, but the Nautilus lives in a separate world, and the secrets of its scientists don't make their way ashore. You're right, Professor, he told me after a few moments of silence. This is a separate world. It's as alien to the Earth as the planets accompanying our globe around the sun, and will never become familiar with the work of scientists on Saturn or Jupiter. But since fate has linked our two lives, I can reveal the results of my observations to you. I'm all attention, Captain. You're aware, Professor, that salt water is denser than fresh water, but this density isn't uniform. In essence, if I represent the density of fresh water by 1.000, then I find 1.028 for the waters of the Atlantic, 1.026 for the waters of the Pacific, 1.030 for the waters of the Mediterranean. Aha, I thought, so he ventures into the Mediterranean. 1.018 for the waters of the Ionian Sea, and 1.029 for the waters of the Adriatic. Assuredly, the Nautilus didn't avoid the heavily traveled seas of Europe, and from this insight I concluded that the ship would take us back, perhaps very soon, to more civilized shores. I expected Ned Land to greet this news with unfeigned satisfaction. For several days our work hours were spent in all sorts of experiments, on the degree of salinity in waters of different depths, or on their electric properties, coloration, and transparency. And in every instance Captain Nemo displayed an ingenuity equalled only by his graciousness toward me. Then I saw no more of him for some days, and again lived on board in seclusion. On January 16 the Nautilus seemed to have fallen asleep just a few meters beneath the surface of the water. Its electric equipment had been turned off, and the motionless propeller let it ride with the waves. I assumed that the crew were busy with interior repairs, required by the engine's strenuous mechanical action. My companions and I then witnessed an unusual sight. The panels in the lounge were open, and since the Nautilus's beacon was off, a hazy darkness reigned in the midst of the waters. Covered with heavy clouds, the stormy sky gave only the faintest light to the ocean's upper strata. I was observing the state of the sea under these conditions, and even the largest fish were nothing more than ill-defined shadows, when the Nautilus was suddenly transferred into broad daylight. At first I thought the beacon had gone back on and was casting its electric light into the liquid mass. I was mistaken, and after a hasty examination I discovered my error. The Nautilus had drifted into the midst of some phosphorescent strata, which, in this darkness, came off as positively dazzling. This effect was caused by myriads of tiny, luminous animals, whose brightness increased when they glided over the metal hull of our submersible. In the midst of these luminous sheets of water, I then glimpsed flashes of light, like those seen inside a blazing furnace, from streams of molten lead, or from masses of metal brought to a white heat, flashes so intense that certain areas of the light became shadows by comparison, in a fiery setting from which every shadow should seemingly have been banished. No, this was no longer the calm emission of our usual lighting. This light throbbed with an unprecedented vigour and activity. You sensed that it was alive. In essence, it was a cluster of countless open-sea infusoria, of noctiluca an eighth of an inch wide, actual globules of transparent jelly equipped with a thread-like tentacle, up to 25,000 of which have been counted in 30 cubic centimetres of water. And the power of their light was increased by those glimmers unique to medusas, starfish, common jellyfish, angel-wing clams, and other phosphorescent zoophytes, which were saturated with grease from organic matter decomposed by the sea, and perhaps with mucus secreted by fish. For several hours the Nautilus drifted in this brilliant tide, and our wonderment grew when we saw huge marine animals cavorting in it, like the fire-dwelling salamanders of myth. In the midst of these flames that didn't burn, I could see swift, elegant porpoises, the tireless pranksters of the seas, and sailfish 3 meters long, those shrewd heralds of hurricanes, whose fearsome broadsword sometimes banged against the lounge window. Then smaller fish appeared, miscellaneous triggerfish, leatherjacks, unicorn fish, and 100 others that left stripes on this luminous atmosphere in their course. Some magic lay behind this dazzling sight. Perhaps some atmospheric condition had intensified this phenomenon. Perhaps a storm had been unleashed on the surface of the waves. But only a few meters down, the Nautilus felt no tempest's fury, and the ship rocked peacefully in the midst of the calm waters. And so it went, some new wonder constantly delighting us. Conseil observed and classified his zoophytes, articulates, molluscs, and fish. The days passed quickly, and I no longer kept track of them. Ned, as usual, kept looking for changes of pace from our standard fare. Like actual snails, we were at home in our shell, and I can vouch that it's easy to turn into a full-fledged snail. So this way of living began to seem simple and natural to us, and we no longer envisioned a different lifestyle on the surface of the planet Earth, when something happened to remind us of our strained circumstances. On January 18, the Nautilus lay in longitude 105 degrees and latitude 15 degrees south. The weather was threatening, the sea rough and billowy. The wind was blowing a strong gust from the east. The barometer, which had been falling for some days, forecast an approaching struggle of the elements. I had climbed onto the platform just as the chief officer was taking his readings of hour angles. Out of habit, I waited for him to pronounce his daily phrase. But that day it was replaced by a different phrase, just as incomprehensible. Almost at once I saw Captain Nemo appear, lift his spyglass, and inspect the horizon. For some minutes the captain stood motionless, rooted to the spot contained within the field of his lens. Then he lowered his spyglass and exchanged about 10 words with his chief officer. The latter seemed to be in the grip of an excitement he tried in vain to control. More in command of himself, Captain Nemo remained cool. Furthermore, he seemed to be raising certain objections that his chief officer kept answering with flat assurances. At least that's what I gathered from their differences in tone and gesture. As for me, I stared industriously in the direction under observation, but without spotting a thing. Sky and water merged into a perfectly clean horizon line. Meanwhile, Captain Nemo strolled from one end of the platform to the other, not glancing at me, perhaps not even seeing me. His step was firm, but less regular than usual. Sometimes he would stop, cross his arms over his chest, and observe the sea. What could he be looking for over that immense expanse? By then the Nautilus lay hundreds of miles from the nearest coast. The chief officer kept lifting his spyglass and stubbornly examining the horizon, walking up and down, stamping his foot, in his nervous agitation, a sharp contrast to his superior. But this mystery would inevitably be cleared up, and soon, because Captain Nemo gave orders to increase speed. At once the engine stepped up its drive power, setting the propeller in swifter rotation. Just then the chief officer drew the captain's attention anew. The latter interrupted his strolling and aimed his spyglass at the point indicated. He observed it a good while. As for me, deeply puzzled, I went below to the lounge and brought back an excellent long-range telescope I habitually used. Leaning my elbows on the beacon housing, which jutted from the stern of the platform, I got set to scour that whole stretch of sky and sea. But no sooner had I peered into the eyepiece than the instrument was snatched from my hands. I spun around. Captain Nemo was standing before me, but I almost didn't recognize him. His facial features were transfigured. Gleaming with dark fire, his eyes had shrunk beneath his frowning brow. His teeth were half bared. His rigid body, clenched fists, and head drawn between his shoulders, all attested to a fierce hate breathing from every pore. He didn't move. My spyglass fell from his hand and rolled at his feet. Had I accidentally caused these symptoms of anger? Did this incomprehensible individual think I had detected some secret forbidden to guests on the Nautilus? No, I wasn't the subject of his hate, because he wasn't even looking at me. His eyes stayed stubbornly focused on that inscrutable point of the horizon. Finally Captain Nemo regained his self-control. His facial appearance, so profoundly changed, now resumed its usual calm. He addressed a few words to his chief officer in their strange language. Then he turned to me. "Professor Aronnax," he told me in a tone of some urgency, "I ask that you now honour one of the binding agreements between us." "Which one, Captain?" "You and your companions must be placed in confinement until I see fit to set you free." "You're in command," I answered, gaping at him. "But may I address a question to you?" "You may not, sir." After that I stopped objecting and started obeying, since resistance was useless. I went below to the cabin occupied by Ned Land and Conseil, and I informed them of the captain's decision. I'll let the reader decide how this news was received by the Canadian. In any case, there was no time for explanations. 4 crewmen were waiting at the door, and they led us to the cell where we had spent our first night aboard the Nautilus. Ned Land tried to lodge a complaint, but the only answer he got was a door shut in his face. "Will master tell me what this means?" Conseil asked me. I told my companions what had happened. They were as astonished as I was, but no wiser. Then I sank into deep speculation, and Captain Nemo's strange facial seizure kept haunting me. I was incapable of connecting 2 ideas in logical order, and I had strayed into the most absurd hypotheses, when I was snapped out of my mental struggles by these words from Ned Land. "Well, look here, lunch is served." Indeed, the table had been laid. Apparently Captain Nemo had given this order at the same time he commanded the Nautilus to pick up speed. "Will master allow me to make him a recommendation?" Conseil asked me. "Yes, my boy," I replied. "Well, master needs to eat his lunch. It's prudent, because we have no idea what the future holds." "You're right, Conseil." "Unfortunately," Ned Land said, "they've only given us the standard menu." "Ned, my friend," Conseil answered, "what would you say if they'd given us no lunch at all?" This dose of sanity cut the harpooner's complaints clean off. We sat down at the table. Our meal proceeded pretty much in silence. I ate very little. Conseil, everlastingly prudent, force-fed himself. And despite the menu, Ned Land didn't waste a bite. Then, lunch over, each of us propped himself in a corner. Just then the luminous globe lighting our cell went out, leaving us in profound darkness. Ned Land soon dozed off, and to my astonishment, Conseil also fell into a heavy slumber. I was wondering what could have caused this urgent need for sleep, when I felt a dense torpor saturate my brain. I tried to keep my eyes open, but they closed in spite of me. I was in the grip of anguished hallucinations. Obviously, some sleep-inducing substance had been laced into the food we'd just eaten. So, imprisonment wasn't enough to conceal Captain Nemo's plans from us. Sleep was needed as well. Then I heard the hatches close. The sea's undulations, which had been creating a gentle rocking motion, now ceased. Had the Nautilus left the surface of the ocean? Was it re-entering the motionless strata deep in the sea? I tried to fight off this drowsiness. It was impossible. My breathing grew weaker. I felt a mortal chill freeze my dull, nearly paralyzed limbs. Like little domes of lead, my lids fell over my eyes. I couldn't raise them. A morbid sleep, full of hallucinations, seized my whole being. Then the visions disappeared and left me in utter oblivion. End of chapter 23.
"20,000 Leagues Under the Seas" by Jules Verne. First part, Chapter 24. the coral realm. The next day I woke up with my head unusually clear. Much to my surprise, I was in my stateroom. No doubt my companions had been put back in their cabin without noticing it any more than I had. Like me, they would have no idea what took place during the night, and to unravel this mystery I could only count on some future happenstance. I then considered leaving my stateroom. Was I free, or still a prisoner? Perfectly free. I opened my door, headed down the gangways, and climbed the central companionway. Hatches that had been closed the day before were now open. I arrived on the platform. Ned Land and Conseil were there waiting for me. I questioned them. They knew nothing. Lost in a heavy sleep of which they had no memory, they were quite startled to be back in their cabin. As for the Nautilus, it seemed as tranquil and mysterious as ever. It was cruising on the surface of the waves at a moderate speed. Nothing seemed to have changed on board. Ned Land observed the sea with his penetrating eyes. It was deserted. The Canadian sighted nothing new on the horizon, neither sail nor shore. A breeze was blowing noisily from the west, and dishevelled by the wind, long billows made the submersible roll very noticeably. After renewing its air, the Nautilus stayed at an average depth of 15 meters, enabling it to return quickly to the surface of the waves, and, contrary to custom, it executed such a maneuver several times during that day of January 19. The chief officer would then climb onto the platform, and his usual phrase would ring through the ship's interior. As for Captain Nemo, he didn't appear. Of the other men on board, I only saw my emotionless steward, who served me with his usual mute efficiency. Near 2 o'clock, I was busy organizing my notes in the lounge when the captain opened the door and appeared. I bowed to him. He gave me an almost imperceptible bow in return without saying a word to me. I resumed my work, hoping he might give me some explanation of the previous afternoon's events. He did nothing of the sort. I stared at him. His face looked exhausted. His reddened eyes hadn't been refreshed by sleep. His facial features expressed profound sadness, real chagrin. He walked up and down, sat and stood, picked up a book at random, discarded it immediately, consulted his instruments without taking his customary notes, and seemed unable to rest easy for an instant. Finally he came over to me and said, "Are you a physician, Professor Aronnax?" This inquiry was so unexpected that I stared at him a good while without replying. "Are you a physician?" he repeated. "Several of your scientific colleagues took their degrees in medicine, such as Gratiolet, Moquin-Tandon, and others." "That's right," I said. "I am a doctor. I used to be on call at the hospitals. I was in practice for several years before joining the museum." "Excellent, sir." My reply obviously pleased Captain Nemo, but not knowing what he was driving at, I waited for further questions, ready to reply as circumstances dictated. "Professor Aronnax," the captain said to me, "would you consent to give your medical attentions to one of my men?" "Someone is sick?" "Yes." "I'm ready to go with you." "Come." I admit that my heart was pounding. Lord knows why, but I saw a definite connection between this sick crewman and yesterday's happenings, and the mystery of those events concerned me at least as much as this man's sickness. Captain Nemo led me to the Nautilus's stern, and invited me into a cabin located next to the sailors' quarters. On a bed there lay a man some 40 years old, with strongly moulded features, the very image of an Anglo-Saxon. I bent over him. Not only was he sick, he was wounded. Swathed in blood-soaked linen, his head was resting on a folded pillow. I undid the linen bandages while the wounded man gazed with great staring eyes, and let me proceed without making a single complaint. It was a horrible wound. The cranium had been smashed open by some blunt instrument, leaving the naked brains exposed, and the cerebral matter had suffered deep abrasions. Blood clots had formed in this dissolving mass, taking on the color of wine dregs. Both contusion and concussion of the brain had occurred. The sick man's breathing was labored, and muscle spasms quivered in his face. Cerebral inflammation was complete, and had brought on a paralysis of movement and sensation. I took the wounded man's pulse. It was intermittent. The body's extremities were already growing cold, and I saw that death was approaching without any possibility of my holding it in check. After dressing the poor man's wound, I redid the linen bandages around his head, and I turned to Captain Nemo. "How did he get this wound?" I asked him. "That is not important," the captain replied evasively. "The Nautilus suffered a collision that cracked one of the engine levers, and it struck this man. My chief officer was standing beside him. This man leapt forward to intercept the blow. A brother lays down his life for his brother, a friend for his friend. What could be simpler? That's the law for everyone on board the Nautilus. But what's your diagnosis of his condition?" I hesitated to speak my mind. "You may talk freely," the captain told me. "This man doesn't understand French." I took a last look at the wounded man. Then I replied, "This man will be dead in 2 hours." "Nothing can save him?" "Nothing." Captain Nemo clenched his fists, and tears slid from his eyes, which I had thought incapable of weeping. For a few moments more I observed the dying man, whose life was ebbing little by little. He grew still more pale under the electric light that bathed his deathbed. I looked at his intelligent head, furrowed with premature wrinkles that misfortune, perhaps misery, had etched long before. I was hoping to detect the secret of his life in the last words that might escape from his lips. "You may go, Professor Aronnax," Captain Nemo told me. I left the captain in the dying man's cabin and repaired to my stateroom, very moved by this scene. All day long I was aquiver with gruesome forebodings. That night I slept poorly, and between my fitful dreams I thought I heard a distant moaning, like a funeral dirge. Was it a prayer for the dead, murmured in that language I couldn't understand? The next morning I climbed on deck. Captain Nemo was already there. As soon as he saw me he came over. "Professor," he said to me, "would it be convenient for you to make an underwater excursion today?" "With my companions?" I asked. "If they're agreeable." "We are yours to command, Captain." "Then kindly put on your diving suits." As for the dead or dying man, he hadn't come into the picture. I rejoined Ned Land and Conseil. I informed them of Captain Nemo's proposition. Conseil was eager to accept, and this time the Canadian proved perfectly amenable to going with us. It was 8 o'clock in the morning. By 8:30 we were suited up for this new stroll and equipped with our 2 devices for lighting and breathing. The double door opened, and accompanied by Captain Nemo with a dozen crewmen following, we set foot on the firm seafloor where the Nautilus was resting, 10 meters down. A gentle slope gravitated to an uneven bottom whose depth was about 15 fathoms. This bottom was completely different from the one I had visited during my first excursion under the waters of the Pacific Ocean. Here I saw no fine-grained sand, no underwater prairies, not one open-sea forest. I immediately recognized the wondrous region in which Captain Nemo did the honors that day. It was the coral realm. In the zoophyte branch class Alcyonaria, one finds the order Gorgonaria, which contains 3 groups: sea fans, Insidian polyps, and coral polyps. It's in this last that precious coral belongs, an unusual substance that, at different times, has been classified in the mineral, vegetable, and animal kingdoms. Medicine to the ancients, jewelry to the moderns, it wasn't decisively placed in the animal kingdom until 1694 by Peysonnel of Marseille. A coral is a unit of tiny animals assembled over polypary that's brittle and stony in nature. These polyps have a unique generating mechanism that reproduces them via the budding process, and they have an individual existence while also participating in a communal life. Hence, they embody a sort of natural socialism. I was familiar with the latest research on this bizarre zoophyte, which turns to stone while taking on a tree form, as some naturalists had very aptly observed. And nothing could have been more fascinating to me than to visit one of these petrified forests that nature has planted on the bottom of the sea. We turned on our Ruhmkorff devices and went along a coral shoal in the process of forming, which given time will some day close off this whole part of the Indian Ocean. Our path was bordered by hopelessly tangled bushes formed from snarls of shrubs, all covered with little star-shaped, white-streaked flowers. Only, contrary to plants on shore, these tree forms become attached to rocks on the seafloor by heading from top to bottom. Our lights produced 1,000 delightful effects while playing over these brightly coloured boughs. I fancied I saw these cylindrical membrane-filled tubes trembling beneath the water's undulations. I was tempted to gather their fresh petals, which were adorned with delicate tentacles, some newly in bloom, others barely opened, while nimble fish with fluttering fins brushed past them like flocks of birds. But if my hands came near the moving flowers of these sensitive, lively creatures, an alarm would instantly sound throughout the colony. The white petals retracted into their red sheaths, the flowers vanished before my eyes, and the bush changed into a chunk of stony nipples. Sheer chance had placed me in the presence of the most valuable specimens of this zoophyte. This coral was the equal of those fished up from the Mediterranean off the Barbary coast, or the shores of France and Italy. With its bright colours, it lived up to those poetic names of bloodflower and bloodfoam that the industry confers on its finest exhibits. Coral sells for as much as 500 francs per kilogram, and in this locality the liquid strata hid enough to make the fortunes of a whole host of coral fishermen. This valuable substance often merges with other polypores, forming compact, hopelessly tangled units known as machiota, and I noted some wonderful pink samples of this coral. But, as the bushes shrank, the tree forms magnified. Actual petrified thickets and long alcoves from some fantastic school of architecture kept opening before our steps. Captain Nemo entered beneath a dark gallery whose gentle slope took us to a depth of 100 meters. The light from our glass coils produced magical effects at times, lingering on the wrinkled roughness of some natural arch, or some overhang suspended like a chandelier, which our lamps flecked with fiery sparks. Amid these shrubs of precious coral, I observed other polyps no less unusual. Melita coral, rainbow coral with jointed outgrowths, then a few tufts of genus Corallina, some green and others red, actually a type of seaweed encrusted with limestone salts which, after long disputes, naturalists have finally placed in the vegetable kingdom. But, as one intellectual has remarked, here perhaps is the actual point where life rises humbly out of slumbering stone, but without breaking away from its crude starting point. Finally, after 2 hours of walking, we reached a depth of about 300 meters, in other words, the lowermost limit at which coral can begin to form. But here it was no longer some isolated bush or a modest grove of low timber. It was an immense forest, huge mineral vegetation, enormous petrified trees linked by garlands of elegant hydras from the genus Plumillaria, those tropical creepers of the sea, all decked out in shades and gleams. We passed freely under their lofty boughs, lost up in the shadows of the waves, while at our feet organ-pipe coral, stony coral, star coral, fungus coral, and sea anemone from the genus Caraphilia formed a carpet of flowers, all strewn with dazzling gems. What an indescribable sight! Oh, if only we could share our feelings! Why were we imprisoned behind these masks of metal and glass? Why were we forbidden to talk with each other? At least let us lead the lives of the fish that populate this liquid element, or better yet the lives of amphibians, which can spend long hours either at sea or on shore, travelling through their double domain as their whims dictate. Meanwhile, Captain Nemo had called a halt. My companions and I stopped walking, and turning around, I saw the crewmen form a semicircle around their leader. Looking with greater care, I observed that 4 of them were carrying on their shoulders an object that was oblong in shape. At this locality we stood in the center of a huge clearing, surrounded by the tall tree forms of this underwater forest. Our lamps cast a sort of brilliant twilight over the area, making inordinately long shadows on the sea floor. Past the boundaries of the clearing, the darkness deepened again, relieved only by little sparkles given off by the sharp crests of coral. Ned Land and Conseil stood next to me. We stared, and it dawned on me that I was about to witness a strange scene. Observing the seafloor, I saw that it swelled at certain points from low bulges that were encrusted with limestone deposits and arranged with a symmetry that betrayed the hand of man. In the middle of the clearing, on a pedestal of roughly piled rocks, there stood a cross of coral, extending long arms you would have thought were made of petrified blood. At a signal from Captain Nemo, one of his men stepped forward, and, a few feet from this cross, detached a mattock from his belt and began to dig a hole. I finally understood. This clearing was a cemetery, this hole a grave, that oblong object the body of the man who must have died during the night. Captain Nemo and his men had come to bury their companion in this communal resting place on the inaccessible ocean floor. No, my mind was reeling as never before. Never had ideas of such impact raced through my brain. I didn't want to see what my eyes saw. Meanwhile the grave digging went slowly. Fish fled here and there as their retreat was disturbed. I heard the pick ringing on the limestone soil, its iron tip sometimes giving off sparks when it hit a stray piece of flint on the sea bottom. The hole grew longer, wider, and soon was deep enough to receive the body. Then the pallbearers approached. Wrapped in white fabric made from filaments of the fan mussel, the body was lowered into its watery grave. Captain Nemo, arms crossed over his chest, knelt in a posture of prayer, as did all the friends of him who had loved them. My two companions and I bowed reverently. The grave was then covered over with the rubble dug from the seafloor, and it formed a low mound. When this was done, Captain Nemo and his men stood up. Then they all approached the grave, sank again on bended knee, and extended their hands in a sign of final farewell. Then the funeral party went back up the path to the Nautilus, returning beneath the arches of the forest, through the thickets, along the coral bushes, going steadily higher. Finally the ship's rays appeared. Their luminous trail guided us to the Nautilus. By 1 o'clock we had returned. After changing clothes, I climbed onto the platform, and in the grip of dreadfully obsessive thoughts, I sat next to the beacon. Captain Nemo rejoined me. I stood up and said to him, "So as I predicted, that man died during the night." "Yes, Professor Aronnax," Captain Nemo replied. "And now he rests beside his companions in that coral cemetery." "Yes, forgotten by the world, but not by us. We dig the graves, then entrust the polyps with sealing away our dead for eternity." And with a sudden gesture, the captain hid his face in his clenched fists, vainly trying to hold back a sob. Then he added, "There lies our peaceful cemetery, hundreds of feet beneath the surface of the waves. At least, Captain, your dead can sleep serenely there, out of the reach of sharks." "Yes, sir," Captain Nemo replied solemnly, "of sharks and men." End of chapter 24. End of the first part.